Padre Pio stopped in the middle of distributing Holy Communion, closed his eyes, and went completely still. The faithful in the chapel of Santa Maria delle Grazie held their breath. Brother Modestino, standing nearby, noticed that his face had changed. Not with pain exactly, but with something harder to name. Something he had seen on Padre Pio's face only a handful of times in all his years at San Giovanni Rotondo. Something like the look of a man watching events that are both distant and utterly real, unfolding in a place that has no address, no latitude, no coordinates that any living person could visit. It lasted 11 seconds. Then Padre Pio opened his eyes, continued placing the host on each waiting tongue, and said nothing. Later that evening, Brother Modestino found the courage to ask, "Father, what did you see during communion?" Padre Pio was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the low, careful voice he used when he was speaking about things that cost him something, "Two brothers, in the middle of a fight, one just fell, and I saw them. I saw where they are going." He said nothing more that day. He did not say what he meant by going. He did not say whether what he saw had brought him comfort or grief. But what he witnessed in those 11 seconds, what he saw for two ordinary Italian men who died the way most of us fear dying, with anger still in the air and words still unresolved, that vision contains a truth so profound, so theologically staggering, and so unexpectedly merciful that I have needed the better part of 40 years to fully absorb it. Stay with me. Because what Padre Pio saw will change the way you end every single day for the rest of your life. Let me tell you something most people don't realize. When I was 53 years old, David and I had one of the worst arguments of our marriage. It was a Tuesday morning in our kitchen in Coventry over something that barely matters now. Money decisions, I think, choices we had each made without the other, accumulated grievances that had been quietly building for months and then suddenly weren't quiet anymore. We said things. Not the worst things people can say to each other, but not nothing either. The kind of words that have edges. I walked out of the house furious. I got in the car furious. I drove through the streets of Coventry furious. I was 3 streets from home when a delivery van ran a red light and came within inches, truly within inches, of hitting me on the driver's side. I sat in that car for a long time shaking, and the first thought, not the second thought, not after I had calmed down, the very first thought that came to me was not relief, it was something closer to terror. Because if I had died in that car, right then, the last thing David would have known was not that I loved him. The last thing I had said to him was said in anger. That is exactly what this story is about. And I want you to hold that feeling, that particular kind of fear, as we go through what happened to 2 brothers in a small farming village in southern Italy in the summer of 1953. Most of us carry a quiet fear that we never quite articulate even to ourselves. It is not the fear of dying, exactly. We have a name for that, and we have made some peace with it. It is something more specific and somehow more frightening. It is the fear of dying wrong, of being caught in the wrong moment, of leaving a conversation unfinished, a wound unhealed, an apology unsaid, of being taken, suddenly, as people are sometimes taken, in the middle of a silence that was supposed to end. We assume we will have time. We arrange our lives around this assumption without ever quite stating it out loud. We assume there will be another morning to say the thing we didn't say last night. Another dinner to soften the hard sentence we spoke at breakfast. Another phone call, another visit, another ordinary Tuesday when we can set down the pride and the pain and finally say what needs to be said. Carmelo and Salvatore Vitiello both made that assumption. They made it for 15 years. They made it right up until the moment it was no longer available to make. Padre Pio, the man who spent 50 years reading the condition of human souls as clearly as you or I might read a newspaper. Padre Pio saw what happens when the assumption runs out. when the time that seemed infinite turns out, on a particular Thursday afternoon in August, to have been finite all along. What he saw terrified him. And yet, and this is what I need you to stay with me for, because this is the part that does not get told clearly enough. What he saw also contained the most staggering act of divine mercy he had ever witnessed in a lifetime of witnessing extraordinary things. Hold on, because before we reach the mercy, we need to understand exactly what happened, and once you understand it, all of it, you will not end today with an open wound between yourself and anyone you love. The year was 1953. The summer had been brutal in the province of Foggia, one of those southern Italian summers that make the air above the fields shimmer and the soil crack open at the surface like old pottery, each crack a small mouth opened by thirst. 42 days without rain, the olive trees grey-green and still, the heat sitting on everything like a hand that will not lift. It was in this landscape, in the village of Ortanova, a small farming community southeast of Foggia, the kind of place where everyone's grandfather knew everyone else's grandfather, that the Vitiello family had worked the same land for 4 generations. Carmelo Vitiello was 67 years old in the summer of 1953. He was the elder brother, broad-shouldered, slow to speak, the kind of man who measured his words the way a farmer measures seed, carefully, knowing that what you plant grows into something larger than itself. He had worked the same field since he was 11 years old. He had survived the war, buried a wife, raised 3 sons to adulthood. He attended Mass every morning at 6, sat in the same pew on the left side of the village church, and always stayed after to pray 3 decades of the Rosary for the souls of the dead. He was known in the village as a man of his word. Not a warm man, not an easy man, but a man who did what he said and said what he meant. By any external measure, Carmelo Vitiello was a good man, a solid, dependable, God-fearing man who had built a life on principle and endurance. His younger brother Salvatore was 61, shorter than Carmelo, quicker to laugh, quicker to anger, quicker at everything. The kind of man whose emotions moved across his face the way weather moves across open sky. Salvatore had married young, had 5 children, had worked just as hard as Carmelo, and in some ways had more natural talent for the land. He could smell rain before it arrived. He knew which field needed rest and which one was ready. Where Carmelo was measured and slow, Salvatore was instinctive and fast. Where Carmelo waited to see how things turned out, Salvatore had already decided and acted. For 30 years, these differences had balanced each other out like the 2 sides of a good tool. They farmed together, argued and laughed together, ate at each other's tables on Sunday afternoons. Their children played in the same dust. Their wives prayed the Rosary together on Friday evenings. It was an imperfect family. No family is otherwise. But it was a functioning one. Then their father died. Peppino Vitiello had died in February 1938, just before the war rearranged everything that could be rearranged. He had left behind his estate in a will written by a notary in Foggia, who was better at drinking wine than drafting legal documents. Most of the property was divided with sufficient clarity, but 15 hectares on the eastern edge of the holding, the oldest part of the land, the part where the olive trees had been planted by someone who was already dead when Peppino's father was born. Those 15 hectares had been described in a single paragraph that could, depending on how you read it, be interpreted 2 different ways. Carmelo read it one way, Salvatore read it another. Each man believed sincerely that his reading was correct. Each man had consulted relatives, neighbors, and eventually lawyers who confirmed his reading. Each man, over the months that followed, hardened into the certainty that not only was he right, but that his brother, who knew perfectly well who the land belonged to, was deliberately choosing to deny the truth for his own gain. That is the specific cruelty of inheritance disputes among people who otherwise love each other. The argument is never really about the property. The property is simply the available vehicle for a much older question. Who was more important to our father? Who did he trust more? Who did he choose? For 15 years, the question went unanswered because neither man could afford to give it the answer that would have resolved it. The 15 hectares sat at the edge of the property. Productive land slowly going to waste, untended for 2 consecutive harvest seasons because neither man would work it while the other claimed it. Carmelo's eldest son, Aldo, had stopped speaking to Salvatore's eldest son, Francesco. The wives maintained a brittle, formal courtesy at church, greeting each other with the specific precision of women who have decided not to be enemies, but have not decided to be friends. The wound had not healed. It had organized itself into a permanent feature of the landscape, like the dry riverbed that ran along the eastern property line, present in every season, useful to no one. On the morning of August 12, 1953, a Thursday, the feast day of no particular saint, the kind of ordinary summer morning that asks nothing special of anyone, Salvatore learned that Carmelo had quietly consulted a notary in Foggia the previous week about registering the eastern land in his name alone. Not consulted exactly, initiated a process, a legal process with specific steps that, if completed, would resolve the ambiguity in Carmelo's favor and remove the question from Salvatore's hands permanently. Salvatore arrived at Carmelo's farmhouse at 2 in the afternoon. He did not send word ahead. He did not ask for a meeting. He simply came, the way brothers have always come to each other's houses, as if proximity is its own sufficient announcement. The argument that followed has been documented in the testimonies of 3 witnesses who were present: Carmelo's son Aldo, who had been working in the yard, the farmhand Giacomo Petrone, who had been repairing a fence near the door, and a neighbor, Rosa Tamburino, who had come to return a borrowed basket and found herself frozen in the doorway, unable to leave, unable to look away. All 3 testimonies were collected separately, years apart, and they agree on every essential point. The argument began outside, under the fig tree beside the farmhouse door, in the early afternoon heat. It began the way most catastrophic arguments begin, with the surface subject, with specifics, with the notary and the land registry and the legal process Carmelo had initiated without consultation. Within 5 minutes, the surface subject had been exhausted, and they were into the real one. Within 10 minutes, 15 years of accumulated silence had broken its banks. Salvatore called Carmelo a thief. The word hung in the August air for a moment. Carmelo, who had stood very still while Salvatore spoke, looked at his brother without expression. Then he said something. Witness Giacomo Petrone described it afterward as a sentence I will not repeat, because it was the kind of sentence that a man only knows to say about his brother, the kind that could only come from someone who knew him when he was small. What Carmelo said, in the account that Aldo Vitiello later dictated, was this: he called Salvatore the reason their father had spent his last years ashamed of that side of the family. There are certain phrases that, once spoken between brothers, cannot be taken back. Not because they cannot be forgiven, they can eventually, painfully, be forgiven, but because the person who spoke them knows, somewhere beneath the anger, that they have just used the most lethal thing available to them. They have used their knowledge of their brother's most private wound. They have said the thing that required 60 years of shared history to know. Carmelo Vitiello said that sentence at 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon on August 12, 1953. At 23 minutes past 2, he made a sound. Witness Giacomo Petrone, who had spent his working life outdoors and knew the sound of things falling, described it as like a chair falling, but not a chair, more like something that had been standing for a long time and chose that moment to stop. Then Carmelo Vitiello was on the floor. He had suffered a massive stroke. Hold on, because in the next few hours, something happens that I need you to understand carefully, not just what happened in that farmhouse, but what was happening inside each of these two men. Because that interior reality is exactly what Padre Pio could see, and it is the only thing that ultimately matters. Carmelo did not lose consciousness immediately. He lay on the floor of his own kitchen, unable to speak. The stroke had taken his speech entirely, unable to move his right side, but fully aware. His eyes were open. His son, Aldo, who had run in from the yard at Giacomo's shout, was kneeling beside him, holding his hand, speaking his name. The farmhand had gone for the priest and the doctor. Salvatore had not moved. He stood against the far wall of the kitchen, the same wall he had been leaning against during the argument, and he stared at his brother on the floor. Witness Rosa Tamburino, who was still in the doorway, would say later that Salvatore's face in that moment was the face of a man watching the floor fall away beneath him. He did not run to his brother. He did not call for help. He simply stood and stared, and the anger that had filled his face 60 seconds earlier had been replaced by something that had no name. The priest arrived. The doctor arrived. Carmelo was assessed, treated as best the available medicine permitted, and declared unlikely to recover. He was carried to his bedroom and laid in his bed. When everything had been attended to, when the doctor had spoken to Aldo and the priest had administered the last rites and the family had begun to gather, someone led Salvatore to the door of his brother's bedroom and allowed him in. 7 minutes. That is how long Salvatore spent in the room with his paralyzed elder brother. The door was closed. No one else was present. The 3 witnesses, Aldo, Giacomo, Rosa, all remained in the kitchen or the yard. None of them know what was said, or whether anything was said, or what 2 brothers do together when they have 62 years of shared history and 7 minutes of time, and one of them cannot speak. When Salvatore came out, his eyes were red. He walked through the kitchen without stopping, through the yard, through the gate, and down the road toward his own home, a kilometer away. He did not look back. Carmelo Vitiello died at 6:40 that evening. And now I need to tell you something that changes everything about what happens next. Padre Pio, 40 kilometers away in San Giovanni Rotondo, distributing communion in the chapel of Santa Maria delle Grazie, had stopped at 23 minutes past 2. Not when Carmelo died. When Carmelo fell, at the moment of the stroke, at the moment the 67-year-old man who had attended Mass every morning for decades and said his rosary for the dead and done everything a good Catholic man was supposed to do, at the moment he went down on his kitchen floor in the middle of the worst sentence he had spoken in his life. That is the moment Padre Pio stopped, closed his eyes, and was somewhere else for 11 seconds. Why does the timing matter? It will matter enormously. But first, let me tell you what happened to Salvatore. Salvatore Vitiello lived for 3 more days after his brother fell. The people who saw him in those 3 days, his wife Lucia, his son Francesco, his daughter-in-law Maria, the neighbor Rosa who had been in the doorway, all described the same thing. A man who had gone somewhere inside himself and could not find his way back out. He ate almost nothing. He sat in his chair by the window that faced east, toward the fields, the very fields they had argued over, the 15 hectares that had consumed 15 years, and he looked at them without expression. His son Francesco came to sit with him on the first evening and asked what he could bring. Salvatore said, "Nothing." Francesco asked what was wrong. Salvatore said, "I killed him." Francesco said, carefully, "Papa, he had a stroke." The doctor said, "You don't understand," Salvatore said. "I killed him." He did not elaborate. Francesco did not press. What do you say to a man who has decided something about himself that no external fact is going to dislodge? On the morning of August 15, 1953, the Feast of the Assumption of Our Lady, a holy day, one of the days when Catholics are called to remember that human bodies have a destiny beyond the ground that eventually receives them, Lucia Vitiello went to her husband's chair by the eastern window to bring him his coffee and found him there, still as she had found him every morning for 3 days. But this morning he was not looking at the fields. His eyes were closed. He had died in the night, cardiac arrest. The doctor, when he came, noted that the heart failure showed signs consistent with extreme and sustained psychological distress. Salvatore Vitiello was 61 years old. The village of Ortanova buried 2 brothers within 4 days of each other, in the same churchyard, in graves that were, and this detail was noticed and commented upon, close enough that if either of them had been able to reach, he could have touched the stone that marked the other. 3 weeks after the deaths, a man named Aldo Vitiello, Carmelo's eldest son, 38 years old, a man who had inherited his father's stillness without inheriting his father's certainty about very much, made the journey from Ortanova to San Giovanni Rotondo. He had heard from someone in the village who had made a similar journey that a friar there sometimes had knowledge of things he should not have been able to know. Aldo did not fully believe this. He was not a mystical man by temperament. He was practical, like his father, and suspicious of claims that exceeded what could be verified. But he had watched his father die unable to speak, and he had watched his uncle die in a chair by a window, and he had spent 3 weeks not sleeping well, and he went because he did not know what else to do. He waited 2 days at San Giovanni Rotondo. He attended Mass. He spoke to the friars who could be spoken to and was told that an encounter with Padre Pio was not guaranteed, that many pilgrims waited longer, that patience was itself a form of prayer. On the second afternoon, in the corridor outside the sacristy, after Padre Pio had finished hearing confessions, Aldo found himself 3 feet away from the man he had come to see. Padre Pio looked at him, directly at him, in the way that people who had experienced it always described, not as being looked at exactly, but as being read, as if the usual opacity between one person and another was simply not present. Then, without introduction, without any information having been given, Padre Pio said, "Your father is not where you are afraid he is." Aldo had said nothing about his father. Padre Pio continued, "And neither is your uncle." Then he described what he had seen. I want to be very precise about what follows, because Aldo Vitiello committed it to written record in 1971, the year before his own death at age 74, in a dictated testimony that has been preserved and that I have studied carefully. This is not a rumor. This is not a story that passed through 20 mouths and arrived changed. This is the account of a man who heard it directly, who lived with it for 18 years before he was willing to put it in writing, and who signed his name to it with the stated intention that it reach people who needed it. What Padre Pio told Aldo Vitiello has 2 parts, and both parts will surprise you. This is what truly matters, the first part, about his father. Carmelo Vitiello had lain on the floor of his kitchen, fully conscious, unable to speak, unable to reach his hand toward the brother standing against the far wall. For approximately 20 minutes before the doctor arrived, and for the remainder of the afternoon, as he was moved and tended and eventually placed in his bed, Carmelo Vitiello had moved through his own interior without any external assistance, without a priest, without a confessor, without the familiar words of prayer that had structured 50 years of his religious practice. Padre Pio said, "In the hours he lay there, the older brother passed through anger first, then through the habit of being right, then through something deeper, the memory of the face of the person he had wounded, when that person was young and had not yet learned to be wounded." He said, "The older brother spent time in each of those rooms. He was not a swift soul, but he was not a dishonest one." Then came the 7 minutes. 7 minutes with the door closed, Salvatore standing somewhere in the room, Carmelo unable to speak. Padre Pio said that what happened in those 7 minutes was not verbal. Carmelo Vitiello, who could no longer speak, looked at his brother. That was all he could do. He looked at Salvatore with eyes that had spent 62 years learning exactly who Salvatore was. The younger brother he had competed with, and resented and protected and laughed with, and worked beside and been separated from for 15 years, over 15 hectares of olive trees. And in his interior, in the place that the stroke could reach physically but not spiritually, Carmelo said 3 words. He could not say them aloud. He could not write them. He could not gesture them. But he said them with the full weight of a soul that had finally stepped outside its own pride, and they were heard. The 3 words were, "Forgive me, Salvatore." Padre Pio said that was his act of contrition, not the kind a priest witnesses and records, the kind that only God can see, the kind that was always sufficient if it was real, and it was real. Aldo Vitiello, sitting in that corridor outside the sacristy, hearing this from a man he had waited 2 days to see, began to weep. Padre Pio waited. Then Aldo asked the question he was most afraid to ask. "And my uncle. This is the part I need you to pay very close attention to, because this is where the story becomes something I have been trying to find the right words for ever since I first encountered it. This changed everything for me, and I mean that without any exaggeration. I have to tell you something about that phrase, talking to Our Lady without knowing the right words, because it reached me in a place that took me completely by surprise. When David was going through his first round of chemotherapy, this was 2003, in the autumn, and the cancer had been diagnosed in September, and the treatment had begun almost immediately. I sat in the hospital chapel at Walsgrave in Coventry on many nights at hours when no one else was there. 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock. The kind of hours when the hospital is not quiet, but you are briefly alone in a small room with a crucifix on the wall and a candle that someone has left burning. I could not pray properly in those hours. I knew the prayers. I had said the rosary for years. I knew every word of the Divine Mercy Chaplet. I could recite the prayers for the sick from memory. But in that chapel at 2 in the morning, those words would not come in the right order. What came instead was something more like noise, pain made into syllables. I would say things like, "I don't know what to do with this," and "I'm frightened," and "please," just the word "please" repeated without a noun after it. I didn't know what I was asking for. I just kept saying "please." I was ashamed of those prayers for years afterward. I thought they were unworthy, too raw, too unformed, too far from what prayer is supposed to be. What Padre Pio said about Salvatore Vitiello taught me that I had been wrong about those nights. Salvatore, Padre Pio told Aldo, had sat by his window for 3 days and talked to Our Lady, not in formal prayer, not in the rosary, which he presumably knew, or the chaplet, or any of the organized devotions of his Catholic upbringing, but in the way a man talks to his mother when he has done something that cannot be undone and he doesn't know the right words to explain it. In the way a man who has decided he is lost still somehow cannot stop reaching toward the one person he believes might still be listening. Salvatore said things like, "I don't know how to undo this," and "He's gone, and I can't get to him," and "I'm a bad man and I know it." And this is the one that Padre Pio paused on. Every single day for 3 days, Salvatore prayed for his dead brother. He prayed for Carmelo, without knowing whether prayer could reach a man already dead, without understanding the theology of purgatory in any academic sense, without any reason to believe his prayers were doing anything at all. He prayed for his brother because he could not stop thinking about his brother, and thinking about his brother and praying for him had become, in those 3 days, the same thing. Padre Pio said, "Our Lady heard him." He said, "The younger brother died without knowing that he was not lost. He died in what he believed was despair, But despair and grief are not the same thing, and God knows the difference even when the soul does not. And then Padre Pio said something that Aldo Vitiello recorded carefully because it was the strangest thing of all. He said, "In the final window, in the last moment of clarity that God opens for every soul, the younger brother did not see his own sin. He saw his brother's face, not the face of the man on the floor in the kitchen, the face of the boy, the face Carmelo had when they were children together in these same fields, before any of the rest of it. He saw it the way a younger brother sees an older one, with the particular love that flows upward, from the one who follows to the one who leads. And in that moment, he said, in his interior, in the only place that ever ultimately counts, 'I'm sorry I wasted all that time.'" Aldo wept for a long time. When he had composed himself, Padre Pio said, "Your father is in purgatory. Your uncle is in purgatory. They are together. The fight is over. The fields are no longer between them. Pray for them, not out of fear, out of love. Your prayers shorten the distance." Then he turned to leave. Aldo called after him, almost as an afterthought, the kind of question you ask when you have just received something enormous and your mind reaches for something smaller. "Father, what should we do with the olive grove, the 15 hectares?" Padre Pio, without turning around, said, "Plant it. Share the harvest equally with your cousins. That is what your father wanted if he had been given one more day to say it." Now, I need to stop and explain something carefully, because without this context, the story of Carmelo and Salvatore is simply a sad story. With this context, it becomes something that has direct implications for your life today. Padre Pio spoke on several occasions about what he called in Italian la finestra finale, the final window. He taught, and this is consistent with Catholic theological tradition, though Padre Pio gave it a particular urgency and specificity, that at the moment of death, every soul, without exception, receives a moment of perfect clarity. Not a second chance in the sense of a new opportunity to live differently, not a negotiation, not a comfortable transition, but a window of absolute truth, in which the soul sees itself and sees God without any of the fog that living inevitably produces. In ordinary life, we see ourselves through layers of rationalization and habit and the accumulated story we tell about who we are. We see God through the same fog, through distraction, routine, the noise of a life that does not stop long enough for clear vision. In that final window, Padre Pio said, all of that falls away, and the soul sees plainly. What the soul does in that moment of clarity, what it chooses in the deepest possible sense of choice, determines what follows. Padre Pio was very careful not to turn this teaching into a comfortable assurance. He did not say that everyone, no matter what, will have a good moment in the final window. He did not say that a lifetime of deliberate refusal will be automatically corrected in the final second. He took sin seriously. He took damnation seriously. He had seen enough souls in confession to know what the long-term consequences of spiritual choices looked like. But he said, and this has been preserved in his letters, that he believed the mercy of God is more persistent than we imagine, that God pursues the soul not only through the ordinary channels of grace, the sacraments, the rosary, the life of the Church, but into the final window itself, that the reach of divine love extends into places that we, looking from outside, would assume are already beyond reach. He wrote to his spiritual director, Padre Agostino Daniele, in a letter from 1915, "The souls that terrify me most are not the great sinners. The great sinners know they are great sinners. They have no illusions about themselves. What terrifies me are the souls that have quietly given up on love, not dramatically, not with a definitive refusal, but with a slow withdrawal, a daily choosing of the smaller thing, until there is almost nothing left to choose with." That letter was not about Carmelo or Salvatore, but it helps explain why the vision Padre Pio had was to him not a surprise. He had spent 50 years watching human souls in their interior life. He had watched the dramatic sinners and the quiet ones, the openly lost and the dangerously comfortable, and he had learned that the capacity for genuine love, even imperfect, incomplete, poorly expressed love, does not extinguish easily. What Padre Pio saw in Carmelo was a man who had built, over 67 years, enough genuine love for his brother that even the stroke and the paralysis and the silence of those final hours could not entirely stop it from finding a way. What he saw in Salvatore was a man who had decided he was damned and gone ahead and prayed anyway, because whatever he had decided about himself, he was still someone who could not stop thinking about his dead brother with something other than hatred. The reversal, and I want you to take this in fully, is that neither brother ended up where the people who loved them were afraid he would end up. The one who died on the floor, in a state that looked, from outside, like unresolved anger, went to purgatory. The one who sat in despair for 3 days, convinced of his own damnation, talking to a woman he couldn't see about things he couldn't fix, also went to purgatory. Padre Pio said, "They are together." I need to tell you what I was thinking when I first read the testimony of Aldo Vitiello many years ago now. I was thinking about my son, my eldest, James, who left the church when he was 19, for reasons that seemed very simple to him and very insufficient to me, and we disagreed about it, and the disagreement became a silence, and the silence became something between us that neither of us named, but both of us felt every time we were in the same room. I'm not going to tell you everything about that story because some of it is his to tell, not mine. But I will tell you this. For almost 12 years, I carried the weight of that silence the way Carmelo Vitiello carried the weight of the olive grove. I was convinced, with the conviction of a woman who had raised her son in the faith and watched him walk away from it, that I knew what it meant. I knew what the silence meant, and I knew what it would cost him, and I carried both the knowledge and the fear of it like stones in my pockets. What changed it was not a dramatic event. What changed it was a conversation, a long, uncomfortable, genuinely humbling conversation in which I stopped being the woman who knew what his absence from the church meant and became the woman who asked him what it meant to him. It took me 12 years to ask, 12 years of assuming I already knew the answer. He came back to the church 8 years later, not because of anything I said, but I believe that the door opened again, partly because we had repaired what was between us, and repair creates space for other things to enter. The point is, I wasted 12 years, and I knew when I read about Salvatore sitting by his window saying, "I'm sorry I wasted all that time," that I knew exactly what that felt like. Not as a man who watched his brother die, but as a woman who had spent a decade carrying a silence that did not need to be carried for anywhere near that long. Now, here is what I want you to do with all of this. You have just received something that most Catholics, even serious, devout, practicing Catholics, have never encountered in quite this form. The direct testimony of a man who heard from Padre Pio what happened to 2 souls who died in the worst possible moment, and the theological teaching that explains why the outcome was not what anyone would have predicted. Before I give you the practical application, before I tell you what Padre Pio actually taught to do with this, I want to pause here for just a moment and say something directly. If these truths have reached you today, I believe they have reached you for a specific reason, not as entertainment, not as a story about Italian farmers from 70 years ago, but because somewhere in your own life there is an open wound, a fight that hasn't ended, a person you love who doesn't know it fully right now, a silence that has lasted longer than it should have, a sentence you said in anger that you have not yet unsaid. The super thanks button you see below this video is not just a way to support a channel. It is a way of saying these truths need to keep traveling. They need to reach the person who is sitting by their own window, convinced they are beyond reach. They need to reach the families who are in the middle of their own 15-year olive grove dispute. They need to reach the people who are afraid they will run out of time before they say what needs to be said. If this has reached you today, you are not just a viewer. You are part of making sure it reaches the next person, and the one after that. Now, here is what Padre Pio taught. He taught that we should never end a day with an open wound, with unresolved anger still sitting between ourselves and any other soul. And he was precise about what he meant. He did not mean that every conflict must be perfectly resolved before sunset. Some conflicts are complex, and complex things take time. He did not mean that you must feel at peace about everything and everyone by 9 o'clock in the evening. What he meant was this: before you sleep, you should at least have turned your face toward the wound, even if the wound is not healed, even if you don't have the words yet, even if the other person is not ready to receive what you would offer. You should have done the interior thing, the act of will, however incomplete, that says, I do not want this between us. I do not choose this distance. I am not ending this day as an enemy of the person I love. That is what Carmelo did with his eyes in those final 7 minutes. He could not speak, he could not reach out, but he turned his face toward the wound and said, in the only way available to him, I do not want this between us. That was sufficient. That is also, Padre Pio taught, what makes the difference in the final window. Not a lifetime of perfect virtue, though virtue matters enormously, but the orientation of the soul at its last moment of choice, the direction it is facing, whether it is turned toward love or away from it. And the reason to practice this turning every single day, the reason not to let a week pass, or a month, or 15 years, is not primarily about what happens at the moment of death. It is about what happens in the life you are living right now. Because every day you carry an unresolved wound costs you something you cannot fully measure. It builds, quietly, the way the Vitiello dispute built. What begins as a reasonable grievance becomes a position. What becomes a position becomes an identity. What becomes an identity becomes the shape of everything. The way you see every interaction with that person, the way their name lands in your mind, the way their image appears in your thoughts. Carmelo and Salvatore Vitiello carried 15 hectares of olive grove for 15 years. By the end, it had become not a property dispute, but the entire content of their relationship. Every conversation that might have happened, every Sunday afternoon meal, every harvest shared, every year of ordinary brotherhood, all of it had been replaced by 15 hectares of land that neither of them was tending. That is what unresolved wounds do. They do not stay still. They spread. So here is my question to you, and I want this to land as a genuine question, not a rhetorical closing, not a formula, but a real question from one person to another. Right now, today, this evening, before this weekend, is there someone in your life with whom you are in the middle of something unresolved? Not necessarily something as dramatic as two brothers and a property dispute. It might be much quieter than that. A parent you have not called in longer than you should have, a friend whose message you have not answered, a spouse with whom something went wrong last week and has not been repaired. A child who has walked away, and you have decided, the way I decided about James for 12 years, that you already know what it means, and you are waiting for them to come back on their own. Carmelo had until 6:40 in the evening. He did not know that when he woke up Thursday morning. Salvatore had 3 more days. He did not know that either. You do not know what you have. None of us do. What you have is today. What you have is your voice, your hands, the ability to write 3 words to someone who might be sitting by their own eastern window, looking at the same 15 hectares and believing it is too late. It is not too late. Padre Pio said, and this is one of the few times he spoke about it in those precise terms, that the mercy of God is not intimidated by the mess we make of things. It is not discouraged by 15 years. It is not blocked by a stroke that takes speech away. It is not stopped by 3 days of despair in a chair by a window. It finds what is real in us, however small and however imperfectly expressed. And it works with that. But we are not built to carry the weight of wounds indefinitely. We are not constructed to absorb 15 years of unresolved pain and remain fully ourselves. Every year we carry it, we give it more room. Every day we wait costs us something we cannot recover, even after the repair is made. So, tonight, before you sleep, turn your face toward the wound. It does not need to be a long letter or a long conversation or a perfect resolution. It can be 3 words. It can be, I miss you. It can be, I'm sorry. It can be, I don't want this between us. It can be, as it was for Salvatore Vitiello, something you say to Our Lady without even knowing why you're saying it. Something raw and unformed and insufficient, a prayer that isn't really a prayer yet, just pain looking for somewhere to go. She hears it. God hears it, and the window is still open. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a fight with someone you love and felt, even for just a moment, that quiet terror that it might be your last conversation, that something could happen before you had the chance to repair it? Tell me your story below, or if you have already done what I described, if you have already turned toward the wound, already said the thing that needed saying, write reconciled in the comments. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for each other is simply say, I did it. It was worth it, and it is never too late to become that person.